20th Century Chicago. I'm Yuki Ishimoto, professor in the Department of Religious Studies and also the director of DePaul Humanities Center. We are honored to co-sponsor this event, which marks the inauguration of a series of events to come, I hope. And for example, thanks to our guest from Japan, Mr. Wakayama, an exhibition of works by Japanese American photographers will take place in 2027 at Tokyo Station Gallery. So we have to go there. However, this event, bringing together all the esteemed panelists and guests today, would not have been possible without my colleague and a dear friend, Dr. Nobuko Chikamatsu. We are bonded with love for food. And Dr. Chikamatsu received her PhD in linguistics from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and is an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages. And she also serves as the director of the Japanese Language and Studies program at DePaul University. She teaches Japanese language and translation with research interests in second language acquisition, Japanese pedagogy, and linguistics. She recently co-authored and co-edited the book, A Transdisciplinary Approach to Chinese and Japanese Teaching, Collaborative Pedagogy Across Languages, Disciplines, Communities, and Borders, 2023. So it just came out. She has been elected to serve as the president of the American Association of Teachers of Japanese in 2025. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Nobuko Chikamatsu.
Thank you, Yuki, for a very kind introduction. I am so grateful for the DePaul Humanities Centers, especially Dr. Yuki Miyamoto and Anna Clisol for their timeless guidance and support. I also want to express my deep appreciation for the Japan Foundation New York, the Tokyo Station Gallery, the Poetry Foundation, and my own unit, DePaul's Modern Languages Department, for their financial support. So today, Roundtable features 3 presentations where the panelists explore the collaborative and personal identities and creativity of Japanese American individuals, focusing on Jun Fujita and other photographers who captured the people and lives of early 20th century Chicago through their lenses. As a native of Japan, I did not have an opportunity or a chance to learn much about Japanese American history until I came to Chicago almost 30 years ago when I started teaching at DePaul. When I discovered that Chicago had a unique and long history of Japanese and Japanese American people, I wanted to learn more. So in 2002, I decided to offer a bilingual course in English and Japanese named Chicago Japanese American History, Chicago Nikkei Jinshi, targeting both international exchange students from Japan and also learners of Japanese at DePaul. Then in 2008, I have a guest visitor in my office, a journalist from Hiroshima's Chugoku Shimbun newspaper, who came to study photographer and tanka poet, Jun Fujita. And then that's how I learned about Jun Fujita. So as a teacher of Japanese language, I have been fascinated by Japanese American poetry, particularly haiku and tanka, written by East Japanese individuals who immigrated to North America in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Their poetry provides a beautiful connection between the 2 languages and culture, which I cannot find in the modern Japanese language textbook. So I really enjoy sharing these poems with my students who also navigate between between the two languages, culture, and identities. So Fujita particularly caught my attention. He came from Japan to North America at the age of 17 and wrote poems in English, his non-native tongue. He was a pioneer of so-called cross-border literature, in Japanese we call ekkyo bungaku, where literary work is created in a non-native language within a non-native cultural setting. So I saw him as a role model and inspiration for learners of Japanese who wish to articulate their target language Japanese for self-expression and creativity. And that is the time or moment I began to wonder if Fujita had ever written tanka in Japanese. If he had, I wanted to find them. So those 10 years passed quickly without my acting on my curiosity about Fujita. It was not until the spring of 2017, after visiting the Poetry Foundation's exhibition, Jun Fujita, Oblivion, that my quest began in earnest. I decided to visit Fujita's birthplace, Onomichi City in Hiroshima, and to search for his Japanese poems and uncover the story of his life before he came to North America. So with support and collaboration from both the US and Japan, we slowly and surely discover more about who he was. Yet he still remained a mystery man, having had little contact with the Japanese community during his life in Chicago. So therefore today, I am thrilled to welcome the presenters who have explored the creative mindset of Jun Fujita and other Japanese Americans from various aspects and various angles and perspectives. I hope this discussion will inspire each of you to delve deeper in their legacies and then also collaborate on future research. So we will have today 3 presentations first, followed by a discussion facilitated by Dr. Miyamoto, and then we will have an announcement of a new book on Jun Fujita, scheduled to be published later this year. So we hope you stay until the end of event, and as we will provide light refreshment and then also opportunities to meet each other individually. So let's start the presentation. So the first presentation is titled Poet as Seer, Jun Fujita's Life and Photography by Catherine Litwin and Fred Sasaki from the Poetry Foundation. And then let me explain who they are. So Miss Catherine Litwin is a library director and exhibition curator at the Poetry Foundation. With Fred Sasaki, she curated Jun Fujita's Oblivion at the Poetry Foundation and Jun Fujita, American Visionary at the Newberry Library, as well as co-edited the exhibition catalog Jun Fujita Oblivion. So Catherine received her BA from DePaul University and then her MLIS from McGill University. In addition to her work in libraries, Catherine is a playwright and theater maker whose work has been published and performed in theaters in Chicago, Los Angeles, London, and New York. And Mr. Fred Sasaki is a creative director and exhibition co-curator at the Poetry Foundation. His work is collaborative, often visual, and tended toward in-person and physical experiences that celebrate people and print. His many publications include Who Reads Poetry, University of Chicago Press, co-edited with Don Scher, and Jun Fujita Oblivion Poetry Foundation, co-edited with Catherine. He also makes art with his family, for Sasaki Family Zines, a friend and family publishing house in Chicago. So, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Fred. It's Catherine. And as I was listening to the introduction, I was really thinking about Jun Fujita is such a hero of ours, but also feels like a friend and feels like family through our relationship with Graham and his discovery and just a kinship we feel around his work. And it's such a pleasure to be here today to talk about the legend of Jun Fujita. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So who was Jun Fujita? Here he is, and something I want to point out, which I often do, is that you can't quite make it out, but if you look right here, this is a pistol that Fujita has included to the side of his writing desk that he forged from wood when he was out writing poems in the woods, knife at his side. It was actually quite a pleasure to display some of his knives and tools during our exhibitions. But so who was Jun Fujita? Jun Fujita was a seer. And I say this to emphasize his perspective on the world as a poet or a visionary in the mystical sense. And here I mean communing with nature, invoking our ancestors, and existing in previously unimaginable ways. I mean, it was so remarkable, unique for him to be a Japanese-American photojournalist in America at this time, to be publishing poetry, to be living this dream as he chose to do. So as a seer, Fujita was also a poet of witness, not necessarily in his poems, but in the way that he documented life in tragedy and turmoil, but also for the beauty before us, inherent in spring wildflowers and in the forever shifting sand dunes. More to the point, Jun Fujita was a Japanese immigrant who became a pioneering photojournalist and poet in Chicago during the first half of the 1900s. As Chika said, he arrived in North America as a teen, studied electrical engineering. He starred in movies for Charlie Chaplin's SNA Studios, and he developed a remarkable career with the Evening Post, where he became known for photographing some of the most pivotal moments in Chicago history, and this includes the Eastland disaster, the 1990 race riots, as well as memorable photos of celebrities, US presidents, and notorious criminals like Al Capone. He was commissioned to photograph federal works projects between the wars for the WPA. He was championed by legendary literary editor Harry Monroe, and he published regularly in Poetry magazine during the 20s. He published his own book of poems, Tanka, Poems in Exile, and continued to write poetry throughout his life, as well as capture the language of wildflowers, as he liked to say. He raced boats. He co-owned a cabin on a remote island near Rainier, Minnesota, and spent long periods there painting and writing poetry, mostly haiku and tanka. So today, we're going to be talking about all of it, and what his legacy as a photographer, as a poet, as a journalist, and as a Japanese American means to us today. So it's important to note, which Chika also alluded to, is that until recently, Jun Fujita lived in mystery. His iconic photographs often circulated without attribution. And there was very little knowledge of his life and accomplishments even in his adoptive hometown of Chicago, not to mention his native Japan. I mean, the world has seen his photos like all over and are very familiar, but yet he himself is not. And his name cannot be found on lists of prominent Chicago writers or artists or poets or photographers, despite his significant contribution to the field. Okay, so here's one of those photos. He was, for example, the first and only photographer on the scene of the infamous St. Valentine's Day massacre. So this photo is, of course, immortalized as perhaps the most iconic Gangland Chicago photo ever, hanging in billiard rooms across town. People don't know who he was, but Al Capone knew who he was. And Al Capone supposedly claimed that Jun Fujita was his favorite photographer because he always caught his good side. Legend has it that Al Capone was so impressed with Jun's skill with a knife that he once upon a time rolled up on him and said, "Hey Fujita, how are you with a gun?" Supposedly Fujita replied, "I'm better with a camera." True to this, Fujita was always among the first on the scene, and without an automobile, no one could understand how this was possible, the way he just sort of would appear around town. And when he wasn't documenting the grandeur and brutality of city living, he found refuge in the woods adventuring. Remember that pistol at his desk. But there his focus was really on wildflowers, dunes, and his wife Florence Carr, whom he met through a mutual love of poetry.
So now I'm going to share one of our favorite poems by Jun Fujita. This tanka was published 101 years ago in the June 1923 issue of Poetry Magazine as part of a series entitled Japanese Brushstrokes, 2 Leaves. Oblivion. There is no time here. From giant trunks, hoary moss hangs through the air of shadowy green, and cool dew drips. Jun Fujita was born in Onomichi City, Japan in 1881. Onomichi City is a place with a rich literary culture. Historically, it has been home to many novelists and poets, as well as many independent magazines and journals. And literature is so valued there that there's a trail paying homage to some of Onomichi City's greatest writers by engraving their words on individual stones, forming a pathway of literary history. And one of our dreams is actually for Jun Fujita's poetry to end up on this pathway, because although he is also one of Onomichi City's greatest writers, that isn't a fact that was known there until recently. Throughout his life, even as he achieved immense success as a photographer, Fujita considered poetry his truest and his most important work. Fujita wrote primarily in tanka, which is a Japanese form of poetry meaning short song, which is comprised of 5 lines in a pattern of 5, 7, 5, 7, and 7 syllables, 31 in all. He adapted this form to be 4 lines in English, but he maintained adherence to the strict economy and precision of the original structure. It's not known how much English he knew when he arrived in Chicago, but within 15 years he'd be publishing English language poems in Poetry Magazine, which is one of the preeminent literary journals in the world. Poetry Magazine was founded here in Chicago by Harriet Monroe in 1912. It's the oldest monthly devoted to verse. Harriet Monroe's open door policy, which was set forth in volume 1 of the magazine, remains the most succinct statement of their mission, which is to print the best poetry written today, in whatever style, genre, or approach. The magazine established its reputation early by publishing the first important poems of T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Marion Moore, Wallace Stevens, H.D., William Carlos Williams, Carl Sandburg, and other now classic authors. In succeeding decades, it's presented, often for the first time, poems by virtually every significant poet of the 20th and 21st centuries. And Harriet Monroe was an early champion of Fujita's work. Upon the publication of his book, Tanka, Poems in Exile, she reviewed the book herself in the pages of poetry, writing, "I doubt if 1,000 carefully toned words could match the impression that it, the poem, gives of stillness." And here we see Tanka, Poems in Exile, which was published in Chicago by local publishers Kobichi McGee and printed by noted typeface designer Will Ransom in an edition of exceptional beauty. And this cover, this image doesn't really translate just how beautiful this book is, but if you do happen to have occasion to see a copy in person, it's just exquisite. The year before Tanka's publication, Kobichi McGee Publishing House launched with Ben Heck's classic 1001 Afternoons in Chicago, which would shortly become the subject of an obscenity trial. In her review, Monroe noted that the printmaker and publishers had brought out the oriental emphasis of the poems through the design of the book, whose loveliness she also noted. I want to think for a minute about Fujita's choice of the word exile in the book's title. As a poet, Fujita was exacting with words. And by the time of Tonka's publication, he was 33. He had lived in 3 countries, been a leading actor in films for Charlie Chaplin's S&A Studios, and photographed most of the important people and events taking place in Chicago during that period. He had found love with his lifelong partner, Florence Carr. By any measure, Jun Fujita's voyage from the land of his birth had led him to a level of success that for most of us proves elusive. And yet, this word exile stands in counterpoint to the narrative in which Jun Fujita moves seamlessly from accomplishment to accomplishment against a glittering backdrop of Chicago. It's there like an undertow or a backbeat. The definition of exile is a period of forced or voluntary absence from one's country or home. And how one defines home, or the country to which one belongs, cannot be quantified by what's written on our passports. Exile is indivisible from loss. The truth that a poem asserts is often contradictory, because in a poem, opposing possibilities are able to be equally true. Fujita continued to write poems throughout his life, publishing regularly in literary journals in the 1920s, such as Others, The Circle, and Youth. His work continued to evolve, and in later years, he produced a series of prose poems about the landscape of the Indiana Dunes. Although he never published another collection after Tonka, poetry remained at the center of his life, and he continued to devote himself to writing throughout the next 40 years. And I'll close with one last poem from Tonka, Summer Moon. The rain crazed like horses in the flare of the lightning that has gone. Against the clear washed sky, raindrops on the twigs reflect the moon.
All right, and so now we'll pivot to look at his photojournalism. Here's a wonderful photo of Jun here. So we'll just kind of go through some of the landmark events that Fujita captured as a photojournalist. Please note that some of these images are difficult and not suitable for all viewers, as they vividly illustrate some of the most tragic and violent moments of Chicago at that time. But I didn't put the hardest ones in here. So just a brief kind of history gloss. The Eastland disaster occurred June 24th, 1915. The Eastland disaster is considered to be the worst maritime disaster in American history. So the SS Eastland, pictured here, was a passenger liner, and it capsized, as you can see, just feet from the shore at the Chicago River. 844 people died, and so this is hundreds more than perished in the Great Chicago Fire. The boat was top-heavy, ironically, due to an abundance of lifeboats that had been added to the ship after the sinking of the Titanic. The ship itself was overloaded with passengers who were primarily or mostly a large number of women and children, immigrant women and children, who had gathered for a company picnic. So they were off to a work event. Here's another one of a diver going into, go inside the Eastland, and this is perhaps the most salient image from the Eastland, probably the most famous. This is the image that, when people discuss the Eastland disaster, kind of most prominent one. Next are photos from the 1919 race riots. So the race riots occurred on Sunday, July 27th, 1919. It was part of riots that swept the nation at a time during what's referred to as the Red Summer, all race riots. And so, just in case you're not familiar with what happened, according to the Chicago History Museum, on the day the riots began, thousands of Chicagoans sought relief from the brutal heat on the shores of Lake Michigan. Among them was Eugene Williams, a 17-year-old African-American. When he and his friends inadvertently drifted across an invisible line that divided the waters by race, a group of whites, insulted by such an act, began throwing stones at them, one of which struck Williams, causing him to drown. after the drowning of Eugene Williams, the police refused to arrest the white man who was considered responsible for his death. As a crowd grew, the tension escalated and the fighting began. So the riots lasted for 8 days, killed 38 people, injured over 500, and caused over 1,000 people to lose their homes. Here's a picture of a family with their few possessions, finding refuge. This is a photo of school children celebrating having kicked out a black family from their home. So these images are among the most recognizable of the riots, including, there's an image which I didn't include here, that is understood to be the first published photograph of a person being murdered. You might also find poet, sociologist, artist Eve Ewing's book 1919. That is a book-length poem on the riots that uses Jun Fujita's photographs in it. So we've already covered the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and Al Capone's fondness for Fujita, but this list includes, many celebrities, icons like Albert Einstein, and of course, artist friends like Chicago's Carl Sandburg.
So although photography began as a job for Jun Fujita, he soon became invested in it as an art form. When taking photographs for himself, he inevitably trained his eye on the natural world. He spent much of his leisure time in nature, both in the Indiana Dunes with Florence and in solitude at his cabin in Rainy Lake in the boundary waters of Minnesota. Many of the artists and writers in Fujita's Chicago circle, such as Carl Sandburg and Vin and Hazel Hannell, loved spending time in the Indiana Dunes. In the late 1930s, Jun and Florence purchased land there to build a vacation cottage of their own. The starkly beautiful landscape of the dunes became the subject of much of his photography, as well as appearing in his poetry. Much like Fujita's poetry, his dunes landscapes exhibit an exacting focus. This prose poem, which appears in an unpublished typescript, displays the aesthetic landscape that he frequently returned to. All is ashen bare, not a wind or a stir. The trees have stenciled their black boughs upon the dull gray. Autumn has gone and winter has not yet come. On this pale slope, too pale to have a shadow, a few leaves rustle about. Now, Fujita also trained his careful eye on wildflowers, and although he was loath to pick them, and he hated the thought of having cut flowers indoors, he was absorbed by an attempt to render their unique individual natures. His photographs of wildflowers are a rare example of artistic preoccupation that he attempted to render only in images and never in text. In a letter, he described this attempt as follows. My approach to photography of wildflowers is somewhat different than that of other photographers. I don't intend to make art photographs. I feel the wildflowers speak very gentle but vivid language. I feel that moods are beyond the reach of the camera, but I feel that words are too crude for the delicate moods of wildflowers. Whether I have succeeded in portraying the delicate moods of these wildflowers, I am not sure. I am trying.
Here's Jun with Florence on the Indiana Dunes. Beautiful photo. Unknown who took this one, I think. Big Brian maybe knows. So I want to talk about Jun's invisibility, which we saw, protected him in the riots, but then his hypervisibility in the tanka poems and the way he carried himself as an artist. This inclusion as a working artist, but then his exile that we find in his poetry. So one of our great frustrations for Jun Fujita is to witness his exclusion from the Chicago canon, as I mentioned. And this kind of like disregard for his life and work as a curiosity. There's so many factors at play, of course, his race, wartime discrimination against people of Japanese descent, and the fact that he was a practitioner of what many still consider a minor art, not to mention the emergent and sometimes maligned art of photography. And so something that fascinated us was that despite his invisibility as a prominent artist for Chicago is his deliberate hypervisibility as a Japanese American. So he diminished his Japaneseness while proving his allegiance to America. He not only divorced himself from the language, but from other Japanese people. We see record letters, writing, emphasizing, I have no connection with Japanese people. I do not associate them. I don't know them, right? I'm not one of them. He found protection with white allies who became his family, and yet perpetuated and centered his Japanese aesthetic in the literal form of his poetry. So we feel that this is a very interesting and vulnerable move for someone who was imperiled by his ancestry, which he otherwise disguised. So how did we get here? How are we all here together, sort of like talking about Jun Fujita, and what have we been doing about it?
So Fred and I became interested in Jun Fujita's story after the donation of his unpublished typescript, which you can see here, and Florence Carr's personal copy of Tanka, Poems in Exile, to the Poetry Foundation offices by the photographer Orlando Cabanban, who was a longtime Chicago Tribune photographer and a friend of Florence and Jun's. Florence had entrusted him with these objects before her death, and he, in turn, turned to Poetry Magazine, one of Fujita's original poetic homes, to care for them. And the more we learned about Jun, the more intrigued we became by his story. We would trace one thread of inquiry and another fascinating strand would emerge. It was hard to believe that a life this intriguing, a photographer whose brave gaze had so shaped our conception of history, was still so unknown. We wanted to share more of his life, art, and inspiration with Chicago and the world. And we were fortunate that a librarian at the Chicago History Museum connected us with Graham Lee, Fujita's great-nephew, and this gave us access to the materials and research that would shape our first exhibition. Our exhibition at the Poetry Foundation opened in January of 2017, and this is Oblivion. The facts of Jun Fujita's life and persecution as an enemy alien had an unfortunate resonance with an era that saw the advancement of Donald Trump's border wall and Muslim ban. We titled our exhibition Oblivion after Fujita's poem and centered his haunting black and white photographs of the Indiana dunes in winter. These landscapes were newly printed for the show from Fujita's negatives. Most had never been previously exhibited. By centering images of beauty, we sought refuge in the natural world, much in the way Fujita himself had done. And the success of our exhibition at the Poetry Foundation inspired renewed interest in Jun Fujita's story. In 2019, we worked with the Newberry Library to curate an expanded exhibition. You can see us there on the opening night, which was augmented with materials from the Newberry's collection, which shed light on the literary milieu that Fujita inhabited, the prominence of his poetry, and also provided additional context for the historical tragedies that he famously documented. We called our exhibition American Visionary because we wanted to emphasize the potential Fujita exemplified of what American can mean. In his life and in his art, we are able to locate both the best and the worst aspects of the American experience. American Visionary opened in February 2020 and closed early due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
You know, it's so corny, but I feel like that initial manuscript donation was such a, just a small ripple, right? And the strategy that Orlando Cabanban had by donating the poetry to us and then reaching out to you, Graham, set us off toward each other. Took a few years for it to happen, but now that ripple will cross over to Japan. It's just so remarkable. And so we're thinking about who is Jun Fujita in the future? I love this portrait of him from his press pass to the World's Fair, which I believe he was there for boating, to cover boating, if I'm right. Because as I said, he was an avid boater, racer. So we blew this up for the Newberry exhibition and felt like such a statement or question about where we are with relation to all of these things that we're talking about. So our dream is for this work to foster a larger audience and understanding of Jun Fujita, and not only his poetry and photography, but the landscape that he inhabited. And despite the fact that we're not fans of the ivory tower gatekeeping or not into king making, we do want him included on those lists that acknowledge his legacy. We want him there. And you know, with all of this new activity masterfully orchestrated by Professor Chikamatsu Chandler and Mr. Wakayama, we welcome a homecoming to Japan in 2027. And we're thinking about how might we facilitate a better understanding between nations, between people separated by war and sea, by race and nationality, and how might we better grapple with our violent, tumultuous world through these experiences, through these photographs, and of course, through poetry itself. And with that, we leave you to the next presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Fred and Catherine. So the second presentation is entitled Chicago's Pre- and Post-War Japanese-American Photographers by Yachen Zhao and Stephanie Lee from the Art Institute of Chicago. So let me introduce the speakers. Dr. Yachen Zhao is an associate assistant curator of photography and media at the Art Institute of Chicago. He previously served as a Marsha Brady Tucker Fellow in Photography at the Yale University Art Gallery. His writing has appeared in History of Photography and Aperture magazine. His current areas of interest include 20th century Asian American photographers and East Asian photography during the Cold War and its aftermath. Yachen received his PhD in art history from Stanford University. And co-presenter, Ms. Stephanie S.E. Lee is a PhD candidate at Northwestern University, studying 19th and 20th century art with a focus on print culture, transcultural mediation, and effect. She currently working on her dissertation entitled Postcards Across Empires, Gendered Labor and Reprographic Technologies Between France and Japan, 1876 through 1945. This year, she was the Dangler intern in the Department of Photo and Media at the Art Institute and a pre-doctoral fellow in the Department of Art History of the University of Michigan. Okay, please welcome.
Yeah, so drawing from a research for foreign exchange, photography between Chicago, Japan, and Germany, this talk surveys the careers of Japanese American photographers before, during, and after World War II. Like Jun Fujita, several Issei and Nisei photographers made Chicago their home. They took up a broad spectrum of subjects and styles, through pictorial, avant-garde, and commercial means. So we're looking at the lives of Shoji Osato, Harry Shigeta, Yuichi Nidaka, and Yasuhiro Ishimoto as pivotal figures of 20th century Midwest photography. We want to show that these artists were embedded in local and international networks of artistic exchange. We also want to underscore their lives and practice beyond incarceration by examining their life and work past the overdetermined narrative and showing the plurality of Japanese American experience in mid-century America. So for instance, let's look at the life and work of Shoji Osato. Shoji Osato was born in northern Japan in 1885. He immigrated first to San Francisco, then to Omaha, Nebraska. There, he worked as a society photographer for a local newspaper. And on the job, he met the young socialite Francis Fitzpatrick. At the time, Francis was designing the quote-unquote Oriental Room at Chicago's Blackstone Hotel. And it was according to Francis, it was over discussions about Japanese art that they fell in love. In 1919, after being denied a marriage license in their state of Nebraska, Shoji and Francis eloped to Iowa and moved to Chicago. The Osato family lived on Michigan Avenue in downtown, not too far from the Art Institute of Chicago. In this photograph, Osato frames the museum's famed lions in a shrouded fog. The couple had 3 children, and they pursued their American dreams. One of his sons pursued academia. His daughter, Sono Sato, seen here in a publicity photo from the Newberry Library, became a renowned actress and dancer, working with Frank Sinatra and the Ballet Russe. Frances made sure her children had a cosmopolitan upbringing. While Shoji stayed in Chicago to work, she took the kids to Paris and New York, where the Osadas were part of a larger network of Japanese expats. For instance, Timmy, Shoji's youngest son, seen here in the portrait, had this drawing done by famed Franco-Japanese oil painter Leonard Fujita during the family's time in Paris. From 1935 to 1941, the Chicago Park District entrusted the Phoenix Pavilion and its gardens to the couple. Osada and Fitzpatrick maintained the building and grounds, running a tea house. On the left, you see a tightly cropped photo of their business. 2 men dressed in suits, grinning over a pot of tea and small plates, while 2 women dressed in kimonos stand behind them. We have some more details about what they serve in this tea house is on the menu from the Chicago Park District Archives. I personally like that they use Ajinomoto, better known as MSG, to flavor the tea sandwiches. For Osato, who was a self-appointed goodwill ambassador of Japan to America, promoting culture in Chicago was of great importance. However, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Osato was arrested literally the next day and incarcerated in a Kenwood mansion for 2 months. The mansion still exists, if you're interested. Soon after, the Phoenix Pavilion closed down and quickly fell into disrepair. There's still a lot of work to be done in Osato's photos and his life. His cityscapes and society portraits are still awaiting examination from scholars and researchers, as there's very little scholarship on the photographer in both English and Japanese. So Japanese and Japanese American population experienced rapid increase during Osato's time. When Osato first arrived in the 1920s, there were roughly 300 Japanese Americans in the city. By 1941, that number rose to 400. But it wasn't until 1942 that under the direction of the War Relocation Authority, tens of thousands of Japanese Americans left incarceration camps into cities throughout the United States. And Chicago was the biggest hub of resettlement for Japanese Americans, numbering 20,000 people. They settled in familiar neighborhoods like Hyde Park, Woodlawn, Northside, Oakland, and Kenwood. And over 30% of the new Japanese American Chicagoans, which included Issei Nisei, war brides, vets, and former internees, lived in the south side of Oakland and Kenwood neighborhoods. So to support the growing community of Japanese Americans in Chicago, the grassroots organization, Chicago Resettler Committee, now known as the Japanese American Service Committee, took charge where the WRA fell short. They helped with employment, housing, and setting up a support network for newly minted Chicago residents. One member of the Chicago Resettler Committee happens to be a well-known photographer, Harry Kinti Shigeta. Originally from Ueda, Shigeta landed in Seattle first. And later, he enrolled at the Minnesota College of Art and Design, which, according to MCAT enrollment records, is where he picked up the name Harry. In 1910, at the age of 23, Shigeta moved from the land of 1,000 lakes to LA, setting up a portrait photography business in the Little Tokyo neighborhood. But by 1924, spurred by growing anti-Japanese settlement in California, Shigeta relocated to Chicago. He found work in the photo retouching department of Muppet Studios, and he found community at the Fort Dearborn Camera Club. The Camera Club is also where he met his future business partner, George P. Wright. When Muppet closed down, Shigeta teamed up with Wright to open Shigeta Wright Studio, specializing in commercial photography. Their contracts included the Pearl Jewelry Company Mikimoto and the 1920s IT Cosmetics brand, Lanchier. Shigeta Wright, 10,000 square foot studio in downtown Chicago boasted a commercial kitchen, which no doubt helped the pair secure lucrative contracts for food photography with companies like Kraft and experiment with cakes and glasses and eggs. In a news write-up, Shigeta supposedly discovered experimental photography through a book of photos by Macaulay Nage, 1930, at the Brentano bookstore in the Loop. And I quote, Moholy-Nage's work convinced him that an original, sharply refreshing understanding of photography was coming to the United States. Shigeta wanted to be on the ground floor when it came. He set to work lightly, experimenting with simple objects like a sheet of glass and an egg. The whole world of photography took on a new and different face. He soon gave up his portrait work to give full time to experimentation for commercial photography. But it's clear from his earlier work in the 20s that Shigeta was independently employing innovative techniques. By 1937, the New World Sun newspaper also profiled Shigeta and his commercial success, hailing him as one of the 10 best photographers in the United States. However, this success was short-lived. In 1941, the American government placed Shigeta under house arrest and forced him to relinquish ownership of property, including his stake in the studio. For a brief period of time, the studio was renamed Wright and McKinley. However, his business partner Wright and his studio staff petitioned the government to lift his house arrest, and the Japanese American English newspaper, Chicago Shinpo, described Shigeta as, and I quote, highly respected and well-loved by his colleagues and others interested in photography, end quote. He was also extolled for his role in promoting photography as well as civic affairs, which you can tell from his work with the Chicago Settlers Committee. So the petition was successful and Shigeta was allowed to work again, returning to 351 East Ohio Street with his name back on the business. And here I have letters written by Harry throughout the time between the name changes of his studio. Shigeta's studio, as I mentioned before, was on 351 East Ohio, and here you see an advertisement in the Japanese American Yearbook that was published in 1947 in Chicago, and a Google Maps screenshot of where it is now. But despite all of this history, Shigeta is perhaps best known for his pictorial work, such as this subtle 1923 photograph named Fantasy in the Art Institute's collection. It's currently on view in the museum's exhibit Foreign Exchange for you to appreciate in person.
Glad you mentioned the show. I was going to say that. This is an exhibition of photography that is at the Art Institute right now and will go on through beginning of September, so please come and see it when you have a chance. I'll go on to talk about the two other photographers that we mentioned, the first being Yuichi Hidaka. And this fellow, much of what we know about him is drawn from his archive, which was given generously to the Art Institute through the Bauhaus Chicago Foundation. Bob is here from the foundation, thank you. It's still being processed, but this includes a tranche of letters, negatives, as well as work prints that he made during his commercial career as a product and architectural photographer. What you're looking at here is a photograph when he was a student in Japan. He was born in Washington State, but moved back to Japan as a young boy to go to school. I think his mother was recovering some kind of illness, and he stayed with friends while he was in Japan. So this is a school photo. But he returns to the U.S. As a teenager, and he moves to Chicago, where his parents are now living. His dad ran a boarding house in Hyde Park, which, as an aside, seemed to be a kind of gathering place for a lot of Japanese Americans, especially those coming to Chicago after World War II. He goes to Hyde Park High School. He graduates from the University of Chicago with a degree in chemistry. And we learned in passing that he didn't get very good grades at U of C, which is a little embarrassing, but whatever. The details are a little fuzzy around this period. As I said, we haven't really managed to go through all this material. But Hidaka, I think, uses his chemistry knowledge towards photography, and he becomes an instructor for Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, we'll talk about this guy a little more, at the Institute of Design, which is the third name of a series of schools established by Moholy-Nagy in the city of Chicago. The first version opened in 1937. This is from the Institute of Design period. This is actually the last year that Moholy-Nagy is alive. But as you can see, Hidaka is teaching photography and motion picture. Pretty good deal if you want to take a class. Now, a little bit on Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. If you are familiar a little bit with the history of photography in the city, Moholy-Nagy was a Hungarian-born artist who first taught at the Bauhaus in Germany. which is this rather famed avant-garde school of art and design from the interwar period. But he moves to Chicago in the 30s. Now on the right there is a photograph of the Dessau location of the Bauhaus taken by Yamawaki Iwa, who was one of 4 Japanese students to attend that school in Germany. Moholy-Nagy was a pretty innovative guy, innovative thinker and teacher, and he was really interested in promoting an idea of light as an expressive material, and this being a specific property of photography as an art form. And he demonstrated this through his art, his own art, as well as his teaching, especially with a process called the photogram, which is a process using photographic material but no camera, where you just expose a piece of photographic paper directly to light by placing things on top of it. So this is one of his photograms from the 20s. He's also well known for organizing something called the Film and Photo exhibition in 1929, which first opened in Stuttgart, Germany, but traveled as well to Japan. They went to Kyoto and Tokyo, I think, maybe Osaka. But anyway. It's kind of hard to understate the significance of this exhibition. If you are a student of 20th century art history, you'll know that this is one of the signal events that sort of demonstrates photography as an avant-garde modern art form. I won't show any images from it, but it was incredibly influential and sort of had a long tail in its impact. And I bring this up because this exhibition toured to Japan, it also was seen by many Japanese artists at the time, including AQ here. You see his work on the left. His name was Yasuhiro Ishimoto. And I'm just putting it next to a montage by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. You can see some of the residences there. It was enormously impactful in the country. Now, after Moholy-Nagy left Germany, he left Nazi Germany to come to Chicago, he established a series of successor schools here in the city, all around the Streeterville location, actually pretty close to where Shigeta had his studio. And it was first called the New Bauhaus, and then it was called the School of Design, then the Institute of Design, and eventually it's absorbed into IIT. If you're curious about this, a former curator in our department, David Travis, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, curated an exhibition called Taken by Design, which goes into greater depth about this period and the artists that came out of it. But as you can see, this is a photograph by Hidaka. I think that he first studied at the school with Moholy and then became a teacher. But I show this, which is also in our exhibition, just to demonstrate he was pretty good at making photographs. And we haven't found any evidence, though it seems pretty obvious that he did, experience heightened scrutiny from the government in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. It seems reasonable to assume he was under some kind of surveillance. And this likely contributed to his retreat from teaching at the Institute of Design after Moholy-Nagy passed away. He initially worked with 2 alumni of the Institute of Design, Frank Bartolucci and Angelo Testa. They had a studio together on Ontario Street. But then later started a business with this guy, Ryuichi Sugasawara, who was previously incarcerated at Tool Lake, but relocated to the city. I bring this up because this is the sort of advertising photography that Riley and Yuichi did together. Very wonderful storefront. This is an ad for a perfume Taboo that you can actually still buy today. But I point out also their names. Yuichi went by Eugene, and this is seen all over his correspondence. He probably picked up that name in high school. But Ryuichi Sugasawara, you see, has anglicized his name to Riley Osuga, which is a nice, Irish way to change your name. It's like if I changed my name to, Getchen Ozao or something like that. But it made for a good pair. Now, aside from his work appearing in a 1951 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art concerning abstract photography, it seems like he retreated from any kind of self-sustaining career as an artist after World War II. He worked for decades as a product and architectural photographer. He probably used Shigeta's kitchen. We have a lot of examples of food photography in the library. And he did this for, I think, like 4 decades. He retired in the 1980s, moved to New Hampshire, and passed away in 2012. He's got 2 daughters, one of whom lives in New York, I know, and was very grateful to see some of these pictures on the wall of the museum. I'll move on to Ishimoto in a second, but I do want to stop for a little bit on this picture, which is a self-portrait and reflection, classic kind of thing for photographers to do, taken shortly after the end of World War II. And so that's the Fine Arts Building, just south of the museum on Michigan Avenue. And I think it's just particularly poignant and perhaps gestures to a bit of ambivalence that he had about his position in the country and also his status as an artist or, whatever he was going to do in his life. Because this is, more or less, soon after this, he does not really exhibit as an artist anymore, just works as a photographer. But as you can see in the center of this image, there is that classic slogan of the Fine Arts Building, all passes, all art shall endure. And this really speaks to something that I hope that we can, research more about, is like what was really his relationship to his career as an artist in that self-conscious sense versus the work that he did after World War II. In the interest of time, I will just give a sketch of Yasuhiro Ishimoto, who is probably the best known Japanese-American photographer. He was born in the US as well, moved to Japan, came back just in time to get incarcerated in Machi. Basically to get out of the camp, he agreed to move to Chicago and go to school. And in doing that, he became a student at the Institute of Design, which was after Moholy-Naj's death. Their photography program is run by two photographers, Harry Callahan and Aaron Siskind. And this is work that he made probably for one of Harry Callahan's assignments, which was to make a composition in which more than 75% of the photograph is sky. It's a great picture. Unlike Hidaka, Ishimoto's place in Chicago photography is really well established. If you're curious about it, again, I push you towards Taken by Design. But for the purpose of this talk, I want to bracket that long career because the DePaul Art Museum did a wonderful exhibition on it, I think, in 2017, which you can still buy the catalog for. But I want to talk about his place in kind of international networks of artistic exchange. And so we can do that by reconsidering what is one of his most famous bodies of work, which are the photographs he made of Katsura Villa, the 17th century Japanese palace in Kyoto. He made these after World War II. The curator Yasufumi Nakamura, who is now at the Asia Society, while he was a curator at MFA Houston, published a book about Katsura, which was this book that Ishimoto made upon returning to Japan. And notably, this book was made with contributions by Kenzo Tange, who is a scholar of Japanese architecture, as well as Walter Gropius, who was a colleague of Laszlo Moholy-Naj's at the Bauhaus. Both Moholy-Nagy and Gropius emigrated to the United States before World War II to escape Nazi Germany and established themselves as very important artists and lecturers in America. But the important thing is that Gropius really liked Katsura. When he went to Katsura with Ishimoto, he basically said, this is all that we've been striving for. Like Katsura is the culmination. They got to, they really embodied as an important precursor to what we were trying to do with the international style of architecture, of which we have many examples in Chicago, notably by Mies van der Rohe. Crown Hall right there in the middle, but I also include this model on the left, which is Gropius's design for the Tribune building. This was his unsuccessful proposal that he made while he was still teaching in Germany. And I put that next to Ishimoto's picture from Katsura just to point out there is some kind of formal similarity going on, which is not to say that, they're copying or something like that. There's no linear style line of influence here, but people are looking at each other, projecting things onto each other. And I think that becomes really clear when you see that even at the Bauhaus in the 1920s, there was a great interest in Japanese art and architecture, which is something that we do explore in this exhibition at length. I'll just say briefly, Johannes Itten, who was a teacher at the Bauhaus, was fascinated by ink painting. He invited ink painters to teach when he established his own school in Germany. As you can see on the left there, Lucia Moholy made a photograph of Laszlo Moholy's design for the stage set of Madame Butterfly, which was put on at the Kroll Opera in Berlin in the 1920s. That picture on the left was one of the real impetuses for the show, along with the Osato picture of the Art Institute, because it sort of indicated to me something that I had intuited for a long time, which was that the Bauhaus was very interested in Japanese art and architecture. And And I put that next to this picture by Harry Callahan of a building in Chicago to again just reiterate, there is some really compelling formal similarities between these things. And it's not about who got to it first, but just indicating that there's a large network of artistic exchange going on here. And out of Katsura, actually, it allowed Ishimoto to reconnect Japanese artists who had been familiar with Moholy-Nagy and other European artists in the 30s to what had been going on in the States after they had moved there. I show you on the left a work by Nathan Lerner, who is one of Moholy's students at the Institute of Design, next to a collaborative work by Katsuhiro Yamaguchi and Kyoji Otsuji, who were part of an experimental group in Tokyo called Chiken Kobo, also known as the Experimental Workshop. Both of them heard talks given by Ishimoto in the 50s talking about developments in photography as an art form. And they were obviously very excited to see that things had happened in the interim between the war. And very self-consciously, I think, continued on with this idea of building constructions, working in the abstract, working in this highly experimental and collaborative way. And I'll just end by saying that there's much more work to do. I'll end with this work by Tad Takano, who was another Japanese-American person relocated to Chicago. He was a designer, and he went on to teach at UIC for many, many years. But in the 1980s, he came up with this computer-driven system to generate a kind of new style of photogram. This computer system was called BIGS. It's very complicated. But Linda Blackwell, who is in charge of his estate here, was very, thankfully was able to bring it to Higher Pictures Gallery in Brooklyn, who are now showing the work. I think it just closed, but I put this up just to say that there's much more to talk about with these artists. And they were not siloed, they didn't just hang out with other Japanese Americans or even hang out with artists just in America. They were all really, really working within a global network of exchange. And that's something that we hope that the exhibition sort of steers people to and invites more and further scholarly reflection on. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie and Yan-Chen. So the final presentation is entitled Exhibiting 3 Chicago-based Japanese-American Photographers in Japan, delivered by Mitsuhiro Wakayama from the Tokyo Station Gallery. Mr. Mitsuhiro Wakayama is a curator at the Tokyo Station Gallery. His main area of research is the history of Japanese modern photography from the early to mid-20th century. He is particularly interested in the work of anonymous amateur photographers and has recently been researching photographs that connect the front lines with the home front during the war, as well as the social function of photography in mid-war Japanese society. Please welcome Mr. Wakayama.
Hello everyone. Thank you for having me at the roundtable today. I'm delighted to be here to discuss the creative mindset of Japanese and Japanese Americans nurtured in the community of Chicago. I'm a curator at Tokyo Station Gallery, an art museum in Tokyo, located in historical Tokyo Station building, originally built in 1914. Since opening our door to the public in 1988, we have served as a special venue for art exhibition. One of our mission to introduce modern Japanese lesser-known artists. I recently co-organized a photo exhibition featuring Nakaji Yasui, a pioneer of early 20th century Japanese amateur photographer. He adopted techniques and subjects that were at the forefront of that era. As a researcher of modern Japanese photography and history, in today's presentation, I'd like to share the plans for upcoming exhibition at our museum in 2027 to 2028. This exhibition will feature 3 Chicago-based Japanese-American photographers who captured the lives and surroundings of people in Chicago and beyond. They are Shigeta, Yasuhiro Ishimoto, and Jun Fujita. Shigeta and Ishimoto were known photographers in Japan, but Fujita's works has not yet been introduced there. Although they may have shared time and possibly crossed paths in Chicago during the early to mid-20th century, their works are unique and have significant yet distinct impact on the history of photography. This will be the first exhibition of its kind in Japan. Therefore, I'd like to share the rationale, implementation strategies, goals, and expected outcome of the exhibition with you, so that your input can be incorporated into our ongoing project. Here's the outline of my talk today. 1, introduction of 3 photographers. 2, interest in Japanese-American photography in Japan. 3, research questions. And 4, collaborations for the future. First, let me give you a brief introduction about Chicago-rooted 3 photographers. Hiroki Shigeta was born in Ueda City, Nagano, Japan, in 1877, and came to Seattle at the age of 16. He opened Shigeta Art Studio with a fellow photographer, George Wright, in the city's north side, and became one of the most successful industrial photographers at the time. In 1965, a 2-person exhibition with Shigeta and Albert Stieglitz was held at the National Museum of Art, Tokyo, and the works were donated to the museum. Jun Fujita, also known as Jun Fujita, had a remarkably diverse background. Born in 1881 in Onomichi City, in Hiroshima, he moved to Canada at the age of 17 and later relocated to Chicago at 21. While attending school and works various odd jobs, including acting in silent films, he served as a photojournalist for the Chicago Evening Post. During the 1910s and 20s, he documented significant historical events such as the Eastern disaster, the race riot, and the Valentine's Day massacre. Fujita was creatively involved in the literary field. He wrote tanka poems for poetry magazines and published the poetry anthologies in 1923. Later, in the 1930s, he was commissioned by the Works Progress Administration, WPA, as a commercial photographer to document post-depression public construction projects. Yasuhiro Ishimoto was born in San Francisco in 1922 and moved to Kochi Prefecture, Japan at the age of 3. He returned to the U.S. to study agriculture at the University of California before being incarcerated during the war. Afterwards, he moved to Chicago and studied photography under the tutorage of Bauhaus at the Chicago Institute of Design. He returned to Japan in 1953, but continued to travel back and forth to Chicago to complete his renowned works such as Katsura Villa and Chicago. The exhibition featured featuring the 3 artists will launch at Tokyo Station Gallery and subsequently travel to 3 cities, Ueda, Kochi, and Onomichi, from 2027 to early 2028. We aim to showcase each artist's work in connection with their respective local cities and to raise awareness of the cultural interaction and cross-point between the US and Japan. Research into the history of Japanese American photography was initiated in North America and did not gain significant attention in Japan until the 1970s and 80s. Key publications such as Joan Rose, Frank S. Matsura, a study of the photographer who lived in Okanogan, Washington, and photographed Native Americans, and Dennis Ray's Japanese Photography in America, 1920s, 1940s. They were translated into Japanese during the 1980s. This translation helped people in Japan learn about the creative achievement of their ancestors in North America. Toyo Miyatake, known for his photographs of Manzanar internment camp, was featured in Japanese Photography magazine in the late 1970s. His work gained further recognition with a solo exhibition in Tokyo in 1980 and a book published in 1984. During the 1990s and 2000s, Japanese Museum hosted several solo exhibitions featuring Japanese American photographers. Notably, Yasuhiro Ishimoto had a solo exhibition at the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo in 1996, and Haruki Shigeta had one at the Ueda Art Museum in 2003. In 2001, Asahachi Kono, who worked in pre-war Los Angeles, had a solo exhibition in Kumamoto Prefecture. And in 2006, Wakan Suzuki, who ran a photo studio in New York, had a solo exhibition in Kichijoji, Tokyo. Recently, as immigration policies evolved and the immigrant population in Japan grows, scholars and artists are increasingly turning their attention to the creative works of Japanese Americans. In 2023, the Museum of Modern Art in Wakayama hosted an exhibition titled Transbordering Migration and Art across Wakayama and the USA. This exhibition showcased paintings and photographs by Japanese American artists with a particular emphasis on pre-war artists who settled on the West Coast. Meanwhile, research and exhibitions have been conducted across the U.S., including those featuring lesser-known artists like Jun Fujita. The Poetry Foundation hosted Oblivion, a poetry and photography exhibition in 2017. And the Newberry Library presented Jun Fujita, American Visionary, in 2019. I'm here to obtain guidance and learn about the cross-disciplinary approaches thriving in North America, especially in Chicago, to make our upcoming exhibition successful and meaningful for a Japanese audience. I have two main goals for organizing this exhibition. First, I aim to explore recent research on Japanese American photographers and use this exhibition as a catalyst to stimulate discussion among Japanese scholars and curators. In recent years, the achievements of Japanese American photographers have gradually come to light. The The result of these studies have the potential to update the overall picture of Japanese photographic history. Discussion on diverse photographic expression will provide us with a broader perspective and deeper insight into photography and the human activities. Another reason I believe that learning about the experience of the early Japanese immigrants in the first half of the 20th century will impact today's Japanese society. Many Japanese today are unaware or have forgotten that their ancestors immigrated overseas, established lives, and become productive community members despite facing hardships. If they were to visit this exhibition and discover the creative mindset and achievements of this pioneer, it might reduce prejudice against non-Japanese workers in convenience store and foster greater respect. Challenging today's lack of understanding and intolerance, one of my personal motivations and primary goals for this exhibition. Photography, invented less than 200 years ago, has had an immeasurable impact on modern and contemporary society. In my research on the history of photography, I explore how people experience photography and its significance in their lives. My primary research question investigates why Japanese American photographers choose photography as their medium of expression. Was it a unique reason specific to Japanese immigrants? Additionally, I aim to challenge the conventional view on the relationship between photographic expression and ethnicity. Whether intentionally or not, their photographic works are often viewed as being directly or indirectly related to their nationalistic Japaneseness. In the 1920s to 1930s, when Fujita and Hurry were shooting photography in Chicago, some Japanese photographers in Japan began to look to ethnicity as a basis for their uniqueness in photographic expression, as they were exposed to foreign photographic expression through magazines and public exhibition. The basic theme of modern Japanese photography was to establish the photographic expression beside. The basic theme of modern Japanese photography was to establish photographic expression based on a logic different from that of the West. Japanese photographers attempt to graft the unique Japanese spirit onto Western photographic expression in various ways. For instance, Shinzo Fukuhara, a founder of the cosmetic business giant Shiseido, and a renowned photographer, points out the similarity between photography and haiku, as the two were closely connected artistic expression, which both captured the momentary illumination of the nature. It theorizes that it is a traditional sensibility cultivated in haiku that characterized Japanese photography, gained tremendous support among Japanese photographers on the time. This is something worth exploring as Fujita proposed tanka as his other way of artistic expression besides photography. Such nationalistic perspective of art and ethnicity were closer examination, especially among Japanese across national borders and lived between Japan and North America. Currently, Ishimoto's materials are primarily housed at the Museum of Art in Kochi, while Shigeta's materials are held at the Ueda Art Museum. Jun Fujita's materials are meticulously preserved by Mr. Graham Lee. We are hopeful that the Onomichi City Museum of Art will collaborate with us to establish Fujita's collection in Japan. I believe that Chicago offers tremendous opportunities for research, given its wealth of resources in public and academic institutions such as the Art Institute of Chicago, Chicago History Museum, and University of Chicago Archives. Additionally, Japanese or bilingual newspapers and magazines, along with archival issue of Chicago Evening Post and Chicago Daily News, where Fujita works, could provide invaluable insights. I urge you to consider the potential for transborder research collaboration to explore Japanese-American artists. And lastly, we, Tokyo Station Gallery, aim to hold the exhibition in 2027. We hope you will come to Japan then and see Chicago photographers in action in Japan. I'd like to conclude my talk. Thank you so much. You're listening.
I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I did so much. And now we have a time for discussion. So my colleague, Dr. Yuki Miyamoto, will be serving as a facilitator. So all the presenters, would you please come to the front?
The presentations, I learned so much, and I was writing down what I've learned from your presentations. And especially I'm struck by the multiple personas of Jun Fujita, and particularly the relationship between the poetry and the photography. In my mind, they are not necessarily a natural combination. So my first question is that, this dual focus, is this particular to Jun Fujita, or there has been cultural, social relationships between these two modes of art? And not necessarily Jun Fujita, but maybe historically, socially, there are some combinations or relationships between these two. So that's my first question.
Thank you so much. What a great question. Do you have an answer on the top of your head? You know, it's funny, like, I don't think we've spent time thinking about this strangely, but I'm immediately thinking of movements of imagism and just modernist poetry in general. And what is it? No facts but in things. What is the famous Williams quote about modernist poetry? Do you remember?
I think that's it, yeah.
Which is like sort of a movement to think, display, experience through the fact of the red wheelbarrow, the white chicks beside the red wheelbarrow. William Carlos Williams' famous poem where he just kind of like describes very plainly in plain language a red wheelbarrow and the chickens, and this is a poem which, you know, no adornment. And so I guess there's a kind of directness between those poetic movements and maybe the art of the camera.
Yeah, in some ways, like for me, they're not natural artistic companions at all, because I think in a poem, there's so much imaginative work that the mind does to make the image. But then on the other hand, in Fujita's work, I think that you do see like a really strong parallel between his photographs and his poetry in the spareness and in the fact that as a poet, you know, he really focused on using as few words as possible. And whereas like poetry is the art form where you're supposed to use as few words as possible, not all poets really adhere to that as strictly as he did. And so that concision, I think, that you see in his poetry is also the same concision that you see in his eye when he captures something as an image, that nothing is there that doesn't need to be there and everything is very composed. But there aren't a lot of, I don't know if you're aware of any like photographers that are also poets, but there's not a lot that come to mind. I know a few.
I would say there are a lot of poets who like photography. You know, Andre Breton and William James both published books that were illustrated with photographs. But I think I take Yama-san's point that there might be something particularly like from an East Asian perspective, a kind of harmony here. If there is an idea that, you know, photography can or should be impressionistic to be an art form, then it kind of coheres with, you know, like writing on the wing or something like that. But you know, I guess like what I would say is, photography seems to describe way too much to be a poem, but a lot of photographers were certainly very interested in literary forms precisely as a way to advocate for photography as an art form in itself. So I think the most notable American example would be, say, Walker Evans, who went to Paris in the 1920s and was very taken by poetry and self-consciously styled himself in this way. But the literary and photography has kind of always gone together. But I'm very interested in, you know, further sort of explication on, you know, Japanese Americans and Japanese photographers acting this way, because I know as well, for example, Soichi Tsunami, who was a New York Japanese American photographer, he also wrote a bit of haiku in his spare time. You know, those things seem to be totally, you know, they were not contradictory things for him.
日本語でいいですか。写真と俳句を結びつけた人の代表格が福原新三という人でした。彼も日本人にとって写真とは何かっていうことを非常に考えていて、その中で、俳句の精神と写真表現というものを結びつけた。でそれがこうなんていうんでしょうか。他国にはない日本の特徴であると彼はそう言いました。で多くの写真家にとって、日本の多くの写真家にとって、俳句と写真っていうのは結構自然と結びつくものだったんですね。というのは写真は数ある趣味の一つだったわけです。で俳句も同じでした。つまり写真をやる人々と俳句をやる人々っていうのは社会階層的にですね、社会階層としてほぼ一緒だったっていうバックグラウンド、日本の表現のバックグラウンドがあります。
This is the first time I'm serving as a translator, so please bear with me. You know, I hope I'll try my best. But so what he said was, you know, as he discussed in the presentation, Fukuhara Shindo, who was a founder of Shiseido Cosmetic, so he was a great example who connected haiku and photography, and he discussed, you know, what photography meant for Japanese people, and then he found something common between haiku and photograph, and then but also the reason why those two could be connected was that the haiku and photography were the hobby among the very high class society members, and therefore it was kind of, you know, natural that they simply did both as a hobby, and then I think they were connected. I mean, if there are any bilingual individual who can add, please let me know, but I think that's what he
Thanks, Chika. Yeah, I just wanted to add to Waka-sensei's point about this kind of like twinning between poetry, like haiku, and photography. Within like the larger visual, like Japanese visual culture in the first half of the century, especially between like the 1910s and 1930s, picture postcards were super, super popular. And even though photography and like poetry writing was a very like high class activity, it was made accessible to the general public through these picture postcards. So like for instance, there is a very famous postcard publishing company called Hinode, and they were set up shop on the like the southern edge of Korea, and they would print up to 10,000 postcards a day. And many of these postcards would have a photograph, and then on the margins would have a haiku or like short song or something. So kind of the viewing experience and like the consuming experience for like these postcard collectors was very like multisensorial in a way. So that's also, I think, to think about when we're like looking at these images and like the general practice.
Thank you.
Oh, are there any of these photographers who had one of those postcards? That seems like
That's a really good point. So many of these, many of the photographers for these postcard companies are anonymous. And that's because some of them have been identified, but they're anonymous because they didn't want to be known for their postcard practice. They wanted to be known for their fine arts practice. And they were making images for, like Hinode, for instance, because they needed to put food on the table. And selling paintings or photographs was kind of hard to pay the bills. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so let me move on to my next question. The current exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago is entitled Foreign Exchange, Photography Between Chicago, Japan, and Germany in 1920 to 1960. And I would like to focus on this foreign exchange part. And Fred informed us that Fujita kind of dissociated himself from the Japanese communities here. But I wondered if he had any connections with people in Japan, like Japanese photographers in Japan, Japanese poets in Japan, or so in other words, between not just Jun Fujita, but other. I was writing down those names, Shigeta and Iraka, and so those photographers, they were having any exchanges with people in Japan, or beyond the relationships between the U.S. and Japan, because Japan had colonies back then. So among those different national borders, not now present day different national borders, I wonder those kind of international exchanges among those photographers.
We're not aware of much contact at all. I think we've seen a few letters to his sister, but aside from that, and it's interesting. And I'd be curious to know how you all see this, but I've always felt Jun Fujita as sort of like an artist about town or in Chicago, and not so much as a photographer solely, but this, I don't want to, the only thing I can think of is Renaissance, figure, swashbuckler, but, I felt like he was known to interact with many artists in town, and, there's a scant record of him appearing at places like the Pickle Club, for example, a famous Chicago artist salon at the turn of the century. So I see those kind of more social interactions, also in his courtship with Florence, but not so much as, I don't want to say he's not a serious artist, but not that sort of artistic life.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting that he saw himself as a poet, although he made his living as a photographer, but I think it's very clear that he thought of poetry as his central art. But to your other question, we didn't come across any evidence of contact with many Japanese people, and it's really hard to know, how much of that was pressure of the time to remove himself, because being part of that community carried very serious liabilities, obviously, and so when documentation that he writes about it, it seems very conflicted, but it's hard to know. But there is one photo that we discovered of him where he is in Miller Beach with a group of Japanese men, and we don't know, who the men are, how he came to be with them. Was very unusual for. Mostly, that's not the case.
And just also pointing out that photography is how Jun Fujita also paid the bills.
Yes, it's his vocation, absolutely.
When I proposed the show initially, I called it Bauhaus Orientalism, but you can't put Orientalism in an Art Institute show title So I changed it to something a little more oblique, which refers to directly foreign exchange students, which is what we used to call international students, people who go to other places to study. And this came about because I learned that there were Japanese students who studied at the Bauhaus in Germany. And as Wakayama-san said, that there was a lively exchange, correspondence between Germany and Japan. Japan based its constitution off of the German constitution. And so there was already a lot of interest between those two nations. As I said, Film and Photo, which was by Mahori Naji, toured Japan and was extremely influential there. And there was, magazines like Kokusai Kenchiku, Asahi Camera, which were actively discussing things like surrealism, other avant-garde movements in Europe. And even when Mahori Naji moved to the United States, he corresponded regularly with a fellow named Takaguchi Shuzo, who was a poet in Japan, very interested in surrealism. And they would send images back and forth. So Mahori was aware of someone like, say, AQ, even in the 30s and 40s. And there was kind of a regular correspondence there. So for me, the exchange part about this is, again, it's just like, it's not one directional. There's a lot of back and forth, and it's also not just between two places. These people moved around a lot, and basically due to various allegiances, breaking and forging of them, people's nationalities become either dangerous for them or helpful for them. And I think that's very true of the Japanese American community in Chicago. For a while, Japan and America were really cool with one another, and then they weren't, and then they were cool with each other again.
Yeah, and to add to that, like Shigeta had visitors. He had Yusuke Nishimura from what's now the Konikuni Nota company, like a camera company, visit him in like 1950. And then Ishimoto going to Katsuda Villa in the first place, and that was a trip that was funded by MoMA, so he could like photograph the villa. And while he was there, he also visited the American Embassy to give a talk about like the state of design pedagogy in America. But then kind of, I guess like, if we backtrack a bit, there was a lot of, I guess like foreign exchange or like kind of like movement and exchange of ideas within Japan as well, like within Japan's empire. So like in 1911, there were 51 photo studios in the colony, in the former colony of Korea. And there were many ethnically Korean artists that were going to Tokyo and Kyoto to like learn painting and printmaking and photography. And I think this is a really like interesting point to bring up, because while they were ethnically Korean, they like entered schools under Japanese names. They spoke fluent Japanese. They wrote in Japanese. And this also goes to poets and writers. Like I think in the 1930s, one of the winners of like a Japanese most famous literary prize was an ethnic Korean, but he published under a Japanese name. So it's not, it's like kind of like interdisciplinary flow and I think code switching within and beyond the empire.
I would just go back and add one thing about Fujita, is that, he was a professional photographer, and this feels very Chicago to me. His work was gritty. He rolled up his sleeves and he made money with it. And it might be interesting to point out, I don't think you mentioned it, but our exhibition at the Poetry Foundation may be the first time his photographs were presented as fine art. Maybe the Dunes photos were exhibited at some point in Indiana, but aside from that, there isn't much record of that. So he was a professional photographer, but as a fine art photographer, was he more of a hobbyist? I don't know how to really answer that.
I was wondering, Fujita was a photojournalist at the Century of Progress, but there was a major photo exhibit there that the Chicago Camera Club had with hundreds of photos. I was wondering if he participated in it as a participant rather than just a journalist.
Yeah, Graham might know best because I was aware of him being there to cover boats.
And
correct?
He was a card-carrying member of the club, but
hallmarks of the Camera Club later.
Yeah, I've got I seem to have a membership of a lot, like Miniature Camera Club was another one I could think of offhand.
Yeah.
I think also though to what you're talking about, Fred, there is also something when Fujita talks about his own work, whether it's his poetry or his photography, there's a way that he has of kind of setting himself apart from other people. And so he did this with his poetry where he'll say like, well, you know, I would write that, but I would write it, you know, in a much more concise way. And I think you see the same thing when he talks about his photography where he puts himself in comparison to like quote unquote fine art photographers, even though, you know, with some of his wildflower and dunes photos, you have to ask yourself, well, it does seem that, you know, that's what you're doing. This is, you know, the same purpose, but I think it's something, so something of that, I think is just in the way he presents himself and thinks about what he's doing.
So before opening up the question to the floor, Mr. Wakayama, would you like to respond?
日本とその海外の交流というところですね。で、まず一般的に一番大きい影響を与えたと言われるのがユジェンさんとステファニーさんの発表にあったフィルムフットフォートっていう国際巡回展でした。で、あれフィルムエンドフォートです。で、多くの日本人写真家がその影響がいかに大きかったかっていうことを書き残しています。で、もう一つはですね、日本の写真雑誌の存在って非常に大きくて、で写真雑誌を通じて実は北米に移住した一世の写真家たちが、文章をその写真雑誌に寄せていたりするんですね。でそれによって、日本にいる写真家たちはアメリカで、どんな写真が流行っているとか、どういうことが行われているということを、知ることになった。でそういう交流が実はあったんですが、あまり実は日本写真史の中でも指摘されることが少ないので、この展覧会についていろいろ調べていければなと思っています。
Okay, so one of the most influential tool was the magazine, and for instance, the film, the one you mentioned, yeah. So that was really there were a lot of records. It said that that influenced their Japanese artist photography. Another thing is that the Japanese photo magazines played a really crucial part of Japanese photography hobbyists, and some of Issei Japanese American published their article to share what's happening in the world and what's a trend in the photography in the U.S. or throughout the world, and that's how Japanese photographers learned what's happening beyond Japan at that time.
Yeah, there was a really popular magazine called Kijutsu Shinpo, which translates to art newspaper, and they would have artists that were studying in France, Germany, the United States, and they would write letters back to be published, to be spread around the colonies, but they would also send postcards and recreations of the art that they saw in the permanent collections. And that was, I think, a really popular way. You can also see it for free online if you subscribe to like JapanKnowledge.com. Yeah, and then Kokusai Kensuku, which is also in our exhibition, is one of the more famous architectural magazines, and it published photographs that were taken by Yamauchi Iwao while he was studying at the Bauhaus in the dressing location.
Thank you.
So now we are excited to share the great news about new book, Jun Fujita, Behind the Camera, scheduled to be published later this year by Hat and Beard Press. And this book is authored by Mr. Graham Lee, a great nephew of Mr. Jun Fujita and then Mrs. Florence Fujita Carr. And Mr. Graham Lee is the author of the book, and then he has dedicated the last 15 years to researching Fujita's life, meticulously retracing his great uncle's footsteps and crafting a narrative that seamlessly intertwine a rich family history with historical and personal photographs. So please welcome Mr. Graham Lee, the great nephew of Jun Fujita.
I have been writing this book for seemingly forever. I keep, at each event I've had an opportunity to talk to, I've been working on this for 5 years, for 10 years. Now we're in 15. I'm so glad that this book is coming out at the end of this year. There's so many people here that have been involved with it. So it's here. So I'm just going to take a short amount of time just to kind of plug the book and really just talk about how important it is for me to document Jun's life. I'm going to borrow this sentence here from an interview I heard recently about someone saying that stories are just one generation away from being forgotten. And that just seems so sad to me because in our family, Jun Fujita was so respected. His books were kind of kept on a shelf. His artwork was everywhere. And then I inherited all of these effects. I'm an only child. We're kind of a saver in the family. So 15 years ago, I told my wife, well, what are we going to do with these boxes of negatives? She inspired me, supported me that let's make a book, let's put it together, and it'll be for the family. We'll have it on the shelf. But in the researching, it tied me to the Eastland Disaster Historical Society. It got me to the Poetry Foundation. It got me to the Newberry. And suddenly I realized that there was already this network of people waiting to talk about Jun Fujita. So I would say look at your own collections of things. Talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents, record their stories. People want to remember these things. Advance. There we go. So there are still mysteries about Jun Fujita. We talked about some of them today. Why he immigrated. One of the answers it kind of touches on here was that an uncle of his gave him his first camera and a passport to directions to go photograph the lumber and salmon industries in Canada. I have no record of any of that. I don't know if any are published. I would love to think he sent those images back to Japan and they were published in the magazine. Maybe someday we'll find them. I have a lot of photographs that I just don't know the history of. So here's a good example of one. So Jun Fujita standing there, and then a young man in the chair. I don't know what the connection is. We talked about what was Jun's relation with the Japanese community in Chicago. I wish I knew who this was. There's nothing on the back other than a date. So it's a mystery. It's a mystery. I will get down closer. Thank you. Here's another fascinating one. Jun taking a rather artful pose there on the end. I don't know who these people are. I like to think that maybe they could have been, I don't know, fellow photographers, a camping trip. I don't know. But I throw these up occasionally at places where I'm like, someone is going to lead me to the next clue in the puzzle. More mystery photos. Jun in the photo, and then another mystery person. I love the outfit that you wear to the sand dunes. That would not be my first choice. Jun and Florence never had any children. I love the photo on the left with the young boy. Probably at the sand dunes. The outfit kind of is the same there. Location pictures. So here's a picture of Jun. Clearly it's a photograph. He wanted an event he wanted to memorialize with a photograph. He's holding a book. I don't know where this is. It's in Chicago. Is it Harriet Monroe's house? Is it something else. It's not a house he lived in. Again, kind of mysteries. I think this is my grandfather in what looks to me like a dog catching truck. I wish I'd asked my grandfather about it, but I don't know. And this is probably my favorite of Jun's mystery photos. It is so staged and wonderfully taken that I just wish I knew what the whole story was. I made it a contest at one point of like someone come up with the caption for this. What is the story here? Can anyone tell me Jun's outfit? Is that a traditional Japanese outfit of any kind? It's nothing. Nothing. Head shaking. All right. So you would think that in my book is a lot of questions, but truly, those are just a few things I don't know. Everything I do know, I did put in the book. And it's a ton of information from family stories and history to research facts about, oh my gosh, the Chicago History Museum has been a lifesaver for pulling out newspaper articles and photographs with all the different newspaper photographs that Jun took. It's got family stories. It's got the Capone story with Capone pulling up along Michigan Boulevard, Michigan Avenue, and more. It's coming out this fall. I can't believe it. I will sign copies. I will come and go wherever you want me to. The publisher was happy enough to produce some postcards for this event. The book is available for pre-sale. There's a promo code, Shigeta, for a 25% discount. That's the end of the plug. Again, I'm just so thankful for everybody. I can't believe that Shigeta will be exhibited in Japan. Going home to Japan, I think, even though Jun kind of segregated himself on a little island in Chicago, I think it would have been a dream of his to go back to Japan. So I can't wait to come to Japan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Graham. So this is the end of the program, and at the end of the program, I just want to thank a few individuals who helped this event, put this event together. Mr. Michael Takada from the Japanese American Service Committee, Mr. Paul Duika from the Chicago History Museum, and Dr. Ayako Yoshimura from the University of Chicago. They really help us, explore Fujita and other Japanese photography's past, and then also Mr. Wakayama could have an amazing opportunity to learn, Jun Fujita and then many other photographers. So thank you so much.